Heather, can you hear me? It's Colonel Cook.
Colonel Cook, yes, I can hear you.
Oh, okay. Just want to make sure I'm linked in. Sorry for the delay. Some technical issues on this end.
No problem.
It looks like I'm in listen-only mode. It's very different setup than earlier today. Is that because you're displaying the slides?
I think so, but I did just see you up on camera, so you should be able. Yep, there you are.
I don't see listed participants or anything else.
There should be on your panel. I don't know if you see like a little control bar with an arrow, but there should be the list of attendees there, and I think I've made it available so everyone can view them.
Okay. Yeah, I see. I've selected view everyone, but I only see you and me.
Oh.
Interesting.
That I don't know about. Well, it's a few minutes after, and I know there's still quite a few people, I think, trying to log in, but to honor everyone's time, I think it's a good time for us to go ahead and get started. So I'd like to thank everyone for joining us this evening for our 5th Restoration Advisory Committee meeting for the Stewart Air National Guard Base. My name is Heather Pfeiffer, and I'm with Burrs Weston. And we'll go in and kind of make our introductions and then get into our welcoming remarks. Next slide, please. So with us today from the National Guard Bureau, we have Robert Subsavage, the Chief of the Environmental Quality Branch, Keith Freihofer, Senior Restoration Program Manager, Joni Murata, Senior Restoration Program Manager, and Nicole Wireman, Restoration Program Manager. Thank you guys. From Stewart Air National Guard Base, we have Colonel Edward Cook, who's the commander of the 105th Mission Support Group and our co-chair for the government. Mike Ottinger, he's the environmental manager, and Master Sergeant Sarah Pastorello with Public Affairs. With the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, we have Michelle Lordman, Kinjal Shah, and Stephen Kitt. And then our contractors, we have Burrs Weston, which I am with, as well as one of our presenters, Doug Close, and then we have a number of members with Wood who will be introduced later. Next slide, please. For our RAC members, we have our community representatives, Ora Lopez-Zarat, Carla Johnson, Edward Lawson, our co-chair, Cassie Skylars, John Clark, Laura Garcia, Ramona Burton, Robert Browning, one of our new members, Robert Sanchez Potter, Ronald Zorilla, and with our community group representatives, Chuck Thomas, Newburgh Conservation Advisory Council, Jack Caldwell, Quassaic Creek Watershed Alliance, Manna Joe Green, Hudson River Sweet Clearwater, Mary Wagner, Newburgh Clean Water Project, and Victoria Loon with Riverkeeper. We also have our government representatives, Anthony Grice with the City of Newburgh, Keith Miller, Orange County, and Patrick Hines on behalf of the town of New Windsor. So thank you everyone for joining us this evening for our RAC members. Next slide, please. Our agenda this evening, next up, we will have our welcoming remarks from our co-chairs, followed by RAC business, our update on environmental projects, our RAC open discussion, and RAC public questions. Again, we plan on ending our meeting at 8 o'clock, but as we have committed to in the past, we will have those 20 minutes for public questions. Next slide, please. And I'd like to turn things over to Colonel Edward Cook, our co-chair, with his welcoming remarks, followed by Edward Lawson.
Thank you, Heather. I would just like to say thank you again to everyone for for joining us during during this quarterly update. We got a great agenda tonight and look forward to sharing our progress. As you can see by the picture, Mr. Lawson joined me last week for a site visit. Although exceptionally cold, I think it was a great visit. We walked the area around Rec Pond and showed Mr. Lawson how each of the pieces of the filtration system works. We had some great discussions and came up with some additional ways that we can be more transparent to what's happening and to help educate the community on where we're at and where we're going, to include things like adding graphics and timelines to the next quarterly updates. So we're really excited to have that, and we look forward to, once we get past these COVID restrictions, to getting the rest of the RAC members on base for the same tour. Hopefully it'll be a warmer day when we do that. It was pretty brutal, right? So I'd like to hand it off to Mr. Lawson, and look forward to the rest of the meeting.
Thank you, Colonel Cook. And as the Colonel suggested, we are moving forward. But I would be remiss if I didn't thank Chuck Thomas, the former co-chair, and Mary Wagner for the yeoman's work in getting us to the space where we have, RAC operating procedures. And in our conversations with the Colonel and with Heather, we did get to a space where we wanted to be transparent, we wanted to adhere to standards, and we wanted to hold each other accountable based on the goals of the RAC. So we're excited about the new partnership and the relationship that we're going to be able to build together. It was interesting. I teach at SUNY New Paltz, and last night was a leadership class that we taught, and I was talking to the students about leadership, and I used the term logos, pathos, and ethos. And the one thing and logos meaning logic, pathos meaning passion, and ethos meaning ethics or credibility. And the one thing that I could say in my conversations with the Colonel and our approach and willingness to be open to the community, share information, I found all three of those things, which is rare. And I'm excited to move forward in that vein. I did want to say one other thing too, with respect to questions. One of the things that we've talked a lot about in our individual RAC meetings was the fact that sometimes responses to our questions are not apples to apple, right? And so it's embedded somewhere in the presentation. And so we did talk to the Colonel and Heather about the possibility of doing sort of apple to apple responses, maybe at the front, referencing it in the PowerPoint, like page 52 on the PowerPoint answers this, but I wanted to give an answer up front so that we have more direct apple to apple responses. Because one of the things that happens with this language and this information, it comes at you a mile a minute and it's very technical. And if we don't do apples to apples, it can sort of overwhelm us. So again, everything that we suggested, the Colonel was very receptive to. As he mentioned, I was able to see the whole interim stormwater management system, and I'm encouraged by the fact that everyone can go out and see it, because you have to see it to really understand it. And I'm also encouraged about just not stopping there. The Colonel didn't allude to the fact that we're still looking for solutions to try to improve and remediate and make better that system. So those things are important, and we want to move forward with. Lastly, I'll say that several RAC members and I are a part of a U of Albany study headed by Dr. Erin Bell, in partnership with Hoosick Falls and several other sites across this country. In the conversation that we had yesterday with Dr. Bell, it seems like they're going to be a real good resource. They have funding. They're going to be doing studies in Newburgh and Hoosick Falls. So I think they will add a lot of capacity to our RAC to be able to converse and to be on the same level and to be transparent. Oh, one last thing. I want to thank Sarah, Major Master Sergeant Sarah Pastorello. She also indicated her willingness to create information, whether it was a video or something, because we're in the 21st century and we take things and digest things through video oftentimes and social media. So she was willing to work with us to be able to create digestible formats and mediums for us to understand what's going on. So I'm excited about that and look forward to that kind of working relationship.
Thank you, gentlemen. We look forward to working with you, Mr. Lawson, in the year to come and continuing the work that we're doing with the RAC and really striving to make information a little bit easier to understand. I know it's environmental projects have their own lingo, and it takes a little while to pick up on it and really digest it. So thank you for that. Next slide, please. So just a couple of our meeting notes and guidelines for this evening. Just a reminder that all public questions will be submitted through that question module that you have on your screen. And like I said at the beginning, we will have 20 minutes at the end of the meeting to address all of those questions. We also will have RAC open discussion prior to that, and the RAC members will have the 3-minute time limit to make questions or comments. We will have an opportunity for the RAC members to ask questions after each presentation topic through raising their hands, and then we will call upon them. Also at this time, as Ed Lawson mentioned, they did submit questions to us. And so Ed, our question is, would you like us to use those questions during that 5-minute time frame after each topic, and we'll address as many as we can and then pick them up at the RAC open discussion, or how would you like us to approach the questions that you provided just before the meeting?
I think the former is the best way to go.
Okay, so we will start with addressing those after each section. If we have time, then we will use the raise your hand feature to allow other RAC members to ask questions. If not, hopefully we'll pick those up either during the RAC open discussion or at during the public comment section. So that is how we will move forward on that. I also did want to mention, if you look at your module, there should be a handout section, and under those handouts, we have a copy of tonight's agenda, as well as a PDF of this presentation. Please note it is slightly revised from the draft presentation that was sent to the RAC 2 weeks ago for review. And then there's also a document that we call our RAC terms and abbreviations. We update that for every meeting, and we're creating this master list, mostly of acronyms that are used. We try to spell them out and limit them in our presentation, but unfortunately, for a lot of us, they become just part of how we speak. And so that is a great reference document if you get confused along the way. But also, please feel free to remind us, and we'll try to say everything out, like Restoration Advisory Committee, if we can. So please look for those handouts. You'll have the entire meeting to download those. Next slide, please. So onto our RAC business. Next slide. We wanted to provide first just a list of our upcoming meetings. So these are the meetings for the rest of the year. Please put them on your calendar. Our next meeting will be April 28th. At this time, we're looking that it will still be virtual. Of course, we're still monitoring the COVID situation and our availability to have meetings in person. If there are any significant changes, we'll look at other options, but for now, we're looking at that virtual meeting for April. The meeting after that is July 28th, and that one, again, we'll plan for the Newburgh Armory, but we'll just have to see what the current situation is, whether it is safe enough to have meetings or if the New York standards have changed allowing those public meetings. Otherwise, that will remain virtual as well. Same for our 8th meeting on October 27th. So that is our plan for meetings. And again, the notifications will go out via email and via the newspaper, articles, and through RAC members with the information about how those meetings will be held. Next slide. We have a couple of updates for those of you who participated in our October meeting last year. The operating procedures were finalized. Again, I'd like to thank all of our RAC members who worked so hard on providing comments and working through the meetings with the Air National Guard to adopt those operating procedures. The copy of the operating procedures were signed by our former co-chairs and distributed to the RAC in December. So there are those final PDFs, and If I have not sent them, I will make sure that our new members have copies of those operating procedures as well. Now we'd like to move on to introducing our 2 new RAC members that were voted in during the October meeting. And if you'll give me one moment, Bob Browning is one of our new members, and then Ronald Zorilla. And Bob, I have unmuted you. If we move to the next slide, I'll let you make a quick introduction.
Yes, good evening. I'm very pleased and honored to be a part of the committee. I have a lot of learning to do, but I believe I can bring some things to the table. I am an Air Force veteran. I was stationed at Stewart Air Force Base before it closed. For the last 40 years, I've worked in the community at a number of different bases, largely as an educator. I've worked on the high school level, early intervention, and I've taught at the Desmond campus, SUNY New Paltz, and Mount St. Mary College. In the last 10 years or so, I've been lucky enough to work in Kuwait, 3 countries in Africa, and in Thailand. So I'm looking forward to learning more, and I look at this as an investment and a watch over for our children and our grandchildren. Thank you.
Thank you, and welcome to the RAC. We look forward to working with you in the coming year and for your term on the RAC. And next, we have Ronald Zorilla. I think I pronounced that. Please correct me if I was wrong. But I have unmuted you if you want to make your quick introduction as well.
Thank you, Heather. It's Zorilla. You're pretty close. Like Bob, I have a lot of learning to do. I'm excited to be part of the process and know that the community is very concerned about our water. I'm passionate about engaging youth and families to protect the environment, and look forward to supporting the team and helping make this process more digestible for the broader community. Thank you.
Thank you. So like I mentioned, we look forward to the experience that both of you will be bringing to our RAC, and we look forward to helping you learn our process or learn more about this program and the Stewart Air National Guard base and the environmental project as we move forward. Next slide, please. And so I will open it up to any of our RAC members. If there is other business that you would like to discuss at this time, please raise your hand and I'll give you a minute to do that. If not, remember we do have our RAC open discussion after our presentations, in which you can bring up topics for future meetings or make other suggestions, as well as we'll get through those questions. I don't see any hands going up. So, let me see. Bill Fetter, did you have a question or comment?
Yes, since no one else is queued up, I'll give it a whirl. Looking back at the historical research and testing that's been done and all the camera work, I was curious, one, I guess, depending on funding and contracts, if there's been any thought to just doing isolated testing in some catch basins and manholes around the site where the hotspots are kind of inferred or think they might be, just to get a head start, or even to begin designing some sort of investigation where you're going to excavate or whatever you're going to do. But anything between now and the beginning of the next contract.
So, Bill, actually, I'll ask you to hold that question maybe until our RAC business or until the RAC discussion. I guess my question, and I may not have made it clear, this was to focus on other RAC-related business.
I'm sorry.
We'll let our presenters get through their presentations, and then we'll open it up for those other, I guess, more project-specific questions. But thank you for your question. So with that in mind, we will move on to our next topic. Next slide, please. And I would like to introduce Nicole Wireman, the Restoration Program Manager for Stewart.
Thanks so much, Heather. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Great, thank you. So good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for taking the time to be here. Welcome to our discussion tonight and our status update on environmental projects at Stewart. Again, my name is Nicole Wireman, and I currently serve as the Restoration Program Manager for Stewart. However, before we continue on in the presentation, I did want to announce a couple of changes in personnel. So I'll start off with myself. I'm actually transferring to a different job, and so as of the end of this week, Jody Murata will become the Restoration Program Manager for Stewart. There's Jody right there, and she may look familiar to you all because actually a year ago, last February, Jody was the program manager for Stewart, and so this is kind of a full circle back for Jody coming back to this. And as you can imagine, she already has a pretty good handle on the Stewart Environmental Restoration Program, but I've been working heavily with Jody over the last several weeks to get her up to speed, and so we don't anticipate any bumps. Expect this to be a smooth transition back to Jody as the program manager. So thanks, Jody, and you will continue to see her probably later on in the question and answer session with addressing some of your questions. Thanks a lot, Jody.
Great. Thanks, Nicole.
Sure. So in addition to that, I also wanted to announce some change in personnel from one of our primary contractors, and that's Wood. We have a new program manager for Wood. His name is Mr. Craig Keating. And Craig, if you don't mind showing, there you go, great. So as many of you know, Wood has worked over the past year on a couple of different projects for restoration. One has been on the expanded site inspection for PFAS, or per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. In addition to that, Wood also works on Site 3, which is our former base landfill. Although we won't be having any presentations tonight specifically on Site 3 or the expanded site inspection, we do have Wood personnel on hand to be able to answer any lingering questions that the RAC members or the public have on that work. So wanted to make sure you know they're available. In addition to Craig, we also have from Wood Mr. Steve Poston and Mr. James Barbas. If you all don't mind showing your Steve, and there's James. Wonderful. Thank you, gentlemen. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Okay, next slide. So this is a slide that should look kind of familiar to those who have been attending multiple RAC meetings. It's a slide we put in to show you, first of all, we provide a link at the top on how to get to our online administrative record. We refer to it as the AR, and that link at the top of the table will provide access to all of our final documents that are completed in accordance with the CERCLA process. And again, CERCLA is an acronym we use for the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act. And that is the federal cleanup law that ANG follows for all of our environmental restoration work. So what we like to do on this slide is give you the AR numbers to make it easier for you to access some of the key documents related to the restoration program. So what you'll see on there in the black writing, for example, is the expanded SI report for PFAS, as well as a couple of the SI reports and other reports. In a presentation later, we'll be making references to those, so I just wanted to point out that all of those AR numbers are right here. The other key point on this slide is the green text. And what that text represents is documents that we've added to the AR since our last meeting. So the first one is the October 2020 RAC meeting materials, and that has the agenda, the slides, answers to any questions that we could not address during the meeting, as well as the transcript for the meeting in both English and Spanish. And so it's really handy to have that put quarterly in the admin record, first of all, for anyone who might have missed a meeting, or for those who attended a meeting but didn't get their question answered during the time frame, or just wants to go back and refresh themselves on something that was said during the meeting. So we encourage you each quarter to take a look at those materials. The second item listed there is the final annual long-term monitoring report for Site 3. And again, Site 3 is our former base landfill. During the last meeting in October, we gave a presentation summarizing the results from that annual long-term monitoring. After the meeting, we received RAC comments on the draft final version of the report, and ANG provided responses to those comments on November 23rd. Those responses, as well as the comments, can be found in that final report shown there. They're in Appendix E of that report. Of course, we also distributed them directly to the RAC, but I wanted to let the public know that you can always look at stakeholder comments in an appendix in the report. We then submitted the final report to New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, or DEC, and received their acceptance of the report on December 17th. So that covers the items that were added in the last quarter. We're now going to proceed to our presentation on relative risk site evaluation, or RRSE, and we're going to cover the process. We are really fortunate tonight to have with us Dr. Brian Howard. He is a toxicologist from the Air Force Civil Engineer Center, and he is a subject matter expert on RRSE. In addition to that, Mr. Keith Freihofer, who is our emerging contaminant lead for Air National Guard, will also be assisting Dr. Howard at the end and throughout the meeting with answering any questions on RRSE. So Dr. Howard, thank you so much for being here. Really appreciate it, and I turn it over to you.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Brian Howard. I know my name says William there on my little photo, but I go by Brian. Thanks for having me here. And so I'm here just to tell you how we use this tool called Relative Risk Site Evaluation, which I'll just call RRSE through most of all of this, to sequence all of our installations. I've done it for the active reserve side, and then we used the same methodology for all of the Air Force. So the Guard used it as well. So I'm just going to be explaining that, and then I'll take your questions at the end, and I'll do my best to answer everything that you can throw at me. Next slide, please. So we're going to talk about what is the RRSE and the framework that we use to complete it. And then how do we evaluate all these sites? So there's like 3 factors. There's the chemical concentration, there's a migration factor, and then there's a receptor, and we call it receptor. That just means, is there a person there to be exposed to it? All right, so, and then how is the media, whether it's water or soil, the relative risk rating determined? Because you could have one release area, let's say you had a fire training area, and you have some PFAS in soils, and then you also have some in groundwater. So you have 2 ratings for the same site. So I'll explain what we do with that, and then how we determine the overall site category. Okay, slide please. So RRSE is a relative risk site evaluation. It's a tool that the Department of Defense has had for quite a while. It's published online. You can find it at this DINEX site. And, you know, I have to apologize. Sometimes that site works for me, and sometimes it does. Sometimes I bring up the document right away, and sometimes it doesn't work. Sometimes the link doesn't work. So if anyone wants a copy of it, if that doesn't work, get back with me, and I'll send one along to Jody to make sure we post it somewhere so you can have access to it if you're having any problems at all. So it's just a standardized methodology that we use to sequence all of our environmental work. So we use it to evaluate the relative risk posed by an environmental restoration site in relation to all the other sites. So like in the active reserve, we had 85 installations and around 850 sites that we had to look at, potential AFFF release areas. And I think the Guard has a similar number. It's, you know, plus or minus 10 on the number of installations and also the number of potential release areas that they had. This relative risk site evaluation primer, it's found here at this link that I've given here. You can download it. It's quite lengthy. It's about 200 pages long and goes into a lot of detail. And the whole goal of our RSE is to have a standard platform that we sequence everything from, right? And so we do the worst sites first, right? The ones that pose the most relative risk now. Next slide. So it's a DoD-wide approach for evaluating the relative risk to human health and the environment posed by contaminants. And it's based on information from each site. So you can see here in this little picture on the right, you've got the installation, and then you might have multiple sites at each installation. And then you look at what the sources were. Was it a hangar release? Was it a fire training area? Was it a spray, a nozzle calibration area? Was it an accidental spill? Sometimes, you know, it might have been an F-16 crash area and we went and foamed down the airplane that was on fire. And then you look at, are there receptors around? And is there a pathway for the contaminants to make it to a receptor, right? Is there a pathway? So think of it like, if you spilled it on the ground, let's say you had an F-16 crash, you sprayed it on the crash, and then it gets in the soil, and then over the years, it migrates through the soil into the groundwater, and then groundwater can flow off-site, and either someone can have a well that's in the groundwater that they're drinking the water, or it can make its way to surface water, and surface water can be used for drinking water as well. Okay, so each of these, so there's the contaminant hazard factor, which is CHF, and then the migration pathway factor, the MPF. I won't use all these acronyms, okay? I'll try to just talk it out. And then the human receptor factor, right? And then the combination of those three sorts each site into either it's categorized as high relative risk or a medium relative risk or a low relative risk. And so this is just a tool we have to categorize, right? It's not the full-on, it's not a risk assessment, right? Which that happens in the process of the remedial investigation. A risk assessment is done where we look at all the different pathways, right? Maybe you have a garden, maybe you have chickens that are fed water, or perhaps you have cattle grazing on pastures that are irrigated with contaminated water, or you eat fish out of a lake. So the risk assessment looks at all those detailed exposure pathways. This is just a relative risk site evaluation to try to categorize and sort them out. All right, next slide. So we require this. So DoD, we just require it for all of our restoration sites in the CERCLA phases prior to remedy in place, right, which comes much later. So right now, I mean, I don't work for the Guard, but I know that they've just finished up the site inspection, and the next piece in the CERCLA puzzle will be the remedial investigation. And in the remedial investigation, you'll do characterization. You know, what are the chemicals in the plume? How far does the plume go? How deep is it if it's groundwater? Who's being exposed to it, and in what ways are they being exposed? Okay. So we have worksheets for each of the environmental media, and it breaks down the factors, the contaminant concentration and the migration, and then the receptor. So in this little picture down below in the little blue box, right, you have our site worksheets. We just have the groundwater and the soil worksheets. And then as we do one for each one of them, and then we categorize each one of them high, medium, or low. And then whatever is higher, soil, for example, or groundwater, that's the overall score for the site. So the highest score ends up dominating what the score for the site is. Next slide. So this is partly what the relative risk site evaluation worksheet looks like, right? There, we'll have an installation map, and then there'll be a worksheet for soil and a worksheet for groundwater. And then the person who's doing it will go through and fill in. And most of the information we can get right out of the site inspection or the expanded site inspection if you have more data, right? It was a hanger release. You had 10 potential releases that occurred between these dates. It ran off of the apron and into a grassy area where it was absorbed into the soil, and it's been there ever since, never been cleaned up, right? That's just a brief description of the site. And then you talk about what are the different pathways. Well, it can get to the groundwater, and we know that the groundwater is flowing in a certain direction. And then you might, if you have the information on how fast it's going, or if a certain aquifer, you have different aquifers, that's the water bearing zones in the soil, right? Some of them are shallow, some of them are deeper, and sometimes maybe the shallow one isn't used for drinking water because it has bad water quality. So you'd want to have all that sort of information to put together into the description of your pathway. And then you'd also have a description of your receptors. Do we have houses that are down gradient? Do you have agricultural receptors that are down gradient that people can consume that? If it's a soil area, do you have people that have access to the soil that they can be exposed to it? Okay. Next slide. So I'll go over this groundwater worksheet. So actually go ahead one slide. I want to go ahead one slide. That's what the worksheet looks like. Go ahead one slide. So the way you determine whether it scores high, medium, or low is we have a screening value, and the screening value that we have used is 1/10 of the EPA's toxicity value that gives you a hazard quotient of 1, right? So a hazard quotient is just like, if you exceed the hazard quotient of 1, it warrants further investigation and may warrant action, right? So we've taken hazard quotient of 1 and then divided that concentration by 10 because we have multiple PFAS at these locations, right? And then if you exceed this, I'm going to call it a comparison value because that's what you're going to see in your worksheets if you guys look at the admin record and analyze it, right? The comparison value for groundwater is going to be 40 for PFOS and 40 for PFOA. And I don't know off the top of my head what the perfluorobutane sulfonate is, the PFBS. So if it exceeds that screening value or comparison value by more than 100, then it gets a significant score. And if the concentration is between 2 times and 100 times the comparison value, it gets a score of moderate. And if it's less than 2 times the screening value, it gets a score of minimal. All right, so, and the concentration value, I mean, I think some of you are going to want to get in and look at the administrative record, and you'll pull down the site inspection document and probably the expanded site inspection document, and you'll look at it. So the number that goes in for the chemical hazard factor, the contaminant hazard factor, it's the highest concentration that was found at that release area. So let's say we put in 3 wells and you had 3 different concentrations. We would use the highest concentration you found, for example, for PFAS, and input that into the equation. So it's using the most conservative way of doing it. All right, so that's the contaminant hazard factor, and that comes right out of your site inspection document or your expanded site inspection document, whichever you have. I think you have both of those documents for Stewart. Next slide, please. Okay, so migration pathway factor, right? So now we're getting into mainly what drives PFAS and PFOA for almost, I would say 99% of our sites in the Air Force and the Guard is groundwater, which ends up being drinking water, or surface water that's connected to groundwater that ends up being drinking water. So if it's evident you have exposure to a contaminant is at a point where exposure to humans can occur, right? So if I have migration, I've gone and measured a drinking water well, and it has PFAS in it, I know it's migrated to the point of exposure, so that's evident, all right? A lot of times, especially these early stages of investigation, we don't have enough information to know if it's migrated that far, because all the site inspections were tasked to determine if there was a release or not. So we went to the area like the nozzle calibration area where they sprayed it, or where the crash site was, or the fire training area, and we investigated there, because the bigger investigation is the remedial investigation, right? So this was just to determine, has a release occurred at a concentration that warrants further investigation, and that further investigation is the remedial investigation. So most of the time, we don't know if it's confined or if it's evident, so you end up going with potential. Sometimes it's confined. It's very rarely confined. Maybe you have some sort of engineered or geologic structure that's in place. Maybe you had an old fire training area that had already been cleaned up and they have a cap on it, for example. So it has a clay cap, so it can't get any infiltration of rainwater into it. So it can't carry the PFAS down through the soil column into the groundwater. So, but that's not our case very often, right? But that's occasionally that happens. So if it's evident, if it's migrated already, so that's a high score. Potential is medium, and that's just kind of, we don't know. And confined, you have to know that it is confined, and it's very low possibility. Next slide. All right, the last one. So the receptor factor. So the highest rating is identified. We know that receptors are there and that they can be in contact with the media. Basically, it's in the well, and there are people there that have the well that are drinking it. That's identified. That gets a high score. And then you have potential. We have some sites where, I mean, out west, we have a lot more uncertain or unidentified receptors. We don't know whether people have wells there or not, or if they're on city water. It takes a lot more investigation. So a potential is a receptor may come in contact with it, and the limited is that the receptor has little or no contact with contaminated media. And we have that at some of our Air Force installations where we have fences around it and no one has access to it except for uniform or civilian Air Force staff, right? So that would be a limited. Next slide. So now to come back to this groundwater worksheet, right? So you go through the document and you find what the highest concentration is of PFAS, PFOA, and PFBS, and that'll be a table in there. When you look at the admin website and you download that SI, the site inspection document, you're going to go through and you're going to find a table in there for each site that will list PFOS, PFOA, PFBS, and what the maximum concentration is. There might be 3 or 4 concentrations, and you use the maximum one for it, all right? And then the comparison value, that's already given to us. We have a policy, we have a guidance memo, I guess, from the Office of Secretary of Defense that we're using these screening values, which are standard. It's a standard way to do it. It's 1/10 of a hazard quotient of 1. And then a ratio is calculated as to how much PFOS or PFOA or PFBS is there relative to the comparison value. And then the ratio is added up for a total ratio. And you can see, for example, this one, I think it says 278, right? So that's over 100. So that means the contaminant hazard factor is high, right? And let's just notionally speak. I know I have a well, and PFOS and PFOA have migrated to the well. It might be a mile or 2 miles. So I know that it's evident. So that gets a score of a high as well. And then since there's a well there, there's probably someone drinking it out of that well. And that means you have an identified receptor, which also scores high. And then the combination of this high, high, high gives you an overall site category of high. And now next slide. Yeah, okay. So there's 8 different ways you can score high for your site. So, and you guys might ask me about this in the questions, I don't know. So we got the first block on the left is where you have significant concentration. So it's over a ratio over 100. The second block, the one in the middle, is where you have between 2 and 100, so it's moderate. And then this third block is where it's minimal. So that would give you a low score. So then if you look at each block, so you have your migration factor on the left. So it goes from confined to potential to evident. And then your receptor factor goes from right to left. It scores, it's limited, potential, identified. So you can see if you have an identified receptor and evident migration in the high contaminant factor, you end up scoring high. You also score high if you have a potential migration and a potential migration with potential receptor, or a potential receptor with an evident migration. And so there's 27 different combinations, right? Since you have 3 factors and you have 3 different possible scores within each factor, you have these 27 different combinations, and this is how they score out, right? So we have installations, for example, that are out in the desert of New Mexico, and the water just drains into them and it doesn't go anywhere. So there's no receptors there and there's no migration potential. So it ends up being down here in this right-hand cube, the minimal one, and they usually score low. Okay, so that's kind of an idea of how these 27 different combinations of high, low, medium give you can get 8 of them that are high, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 8 of them that are medium, and then the remainder are low. Next slide. So if you do one of these for soil and you do one of them for groundwater, the one that ends up ranking the highest ends up prevailing for the site. So if groundwater ranks higher than soil, it gets ranked for groundwater. And that's pretty simple. Next slide. So what's going to happen is the women and men at the ANG, right, are going to get the results of the Stewart RLRSE, and they're going to post it to the online AR coming out. I think it's supposed to happen before the next meeting, the next RAC meeting that you have, and they have the link there that you can get to the administrative record, and Nicole talked about that earlier today, right? And then a public notice will be placed in the Times Herald record, and it'll be sent to the RAC. And I think there's a question that Keith will answer when we get to that, about where we're going to place it and if it's going to be placed in Spanish or not. Keith will answer that later. So there's a public comment period that lasts for 30 days, and you can email your comments to the address that they put in the public notice. Okay. So from my point of view, if you're going to review the RRSE, so you're going to have to download that from the AR, and then you're also going to have to download the site inspection report, because the data comes right out of the site inspection report. And so there's this, it's one quantitative factor, right? So it's the known concentration that we had at the release area, and we're calling them PRLs. The Guard is calling them PRLs, potential release areas, right? What's the highest concentration there? That's what ends up being put into that contaminant factor. And then has it migrated, and there's discussion in there about that. Has it migrated to a point of exposure? And then the last thing is there a receptor there? So those are the three things you need to consider when you're looking at them, and you're going to have both of those documents to be able to do that. And then probably the expanded site inspection might be an additional resource for you. And then when you get that document downloaded, there's these quick navigation aids, there's these quick links on the side of the document that you can jump right to the results. You can just click on it and go to the results. You can click on it and go to the description of the release area, right? Or the description of the receptors. So you can just mess around with it and see how you can navigate through the document, okay? And then, so you send your comments in, and then responses to the comments and a revised RRSE, if we need it, will be posted to the online AR. I have too many acronyms in my head, sorry. It'll be posted in the administrative record. And that's the process in a nutshell. Is that the end, and am I ready to take some questions?
Let's go to our next slide. So I think that is it. Diane, if you can move on to our next slide, and then as we discussed, go on to our next slide, we can start answering the questions that were provided to us prior to the meeting. And then that will start our 5-minute timer for our presentation, and we will get started. Then if we have time, we will answer questions. So our first question is, for the receptors, what sources of human exposure are being considered in the RRSE?
So it's drinking water and exposure to surface soil. And that's actually something to consider if you're going to look at if you're going to dig into the SI. Only surface soil is used. You might find subsurface soil in there. So we're only using surface soil from 1 to 2 feet, and that should be a special table. It's separate from the subsurface soil, right? Because we're looking at, I mean, this is just how it's how the guidance works, the primer works. You use surface soil, and then you use groundwater. And right now we don't have any comparison values for ecoreceptors, for example, or for surface water, as in like a an ambient water quality criteria, for example, as opposed to drinking water. So, and we don't have anything for sediment right now. So it's only those two pathways, right? If you could eat the soil, if a receptor has a possible exposure to soil.
Thank you. Our next question is, how does the NYC connection affect the assessment of Washington Lake?
Okay, so I think this relates to that there's already a response action that's happened there at Stewart, correct? And now that response action has happened, that receptors, that the people aren't drinking the contaminated water anymore because there's already some sort of filtration system. Am I correct? Is that right?
I believe there is a filtration system at Lake Washington from my understanding. I don't know if Keith wants to, or Nicole or somebody else wants to chime in on that.
I'll go ahead and answer though. But I think it relates to, we've taken an action or someone else has taken an action already. And people aren't being exposed through drinking water to the PFAS that was in Washington Lake. That doesn't impact the RRSE score whatsoever. It's still scored as high, I believe. You'd have a receptor there and you would have a pathway to, that's how I would do it off the top of my head anyway. I guess someone will let me know if that answers the mail afterwards, right?
All right, so.
Sorry, I was just going to say, Dr. Howard, that's correct, and that's what we communicated previously, so it's consistent. Thanks.
Yeah.
Our next question is, the Department of Defense considering other methods of public notice beyond the Times Herald? It says post, but I believe that should be record and distribution to RAC members. Will the notice be made in languages other than English?
I'll answer that one. This is Keith Freihoffer. Our intention is to use the Times Herald and to be in English. We will take into consideration other languages, and as well as maybe we could do an email blast to the RAC attendees. If I believe we have an email list of people that have attended the RAC in the past, and maybe we can supplement the newspaper by notifying them. Thank you.
Thank you. Will there be additional opportunities to influence the site prioritization after the RRSE score is finalized?
Well, after it's finalized, then it gets prioritized, and then at some point, a remedial investigation is going to happen, right? We'll start the RI process. And once you're in the RI process, you would have to, the only way it would change or a need for a change is if you discovered a new site, right? And then maybe you'd have to add that site on, or you discovered new chemicals that happen to be there. And if there's a different concentration at your site. Those are the only things that would really impact it that I can see. Maybe a couple of sites that don't impact. I mean, I've never been to Stewart, so I can't tell you, right? I don't know if everything goes into Lake Washington or if some stuff goes in one direction. And so all I know about is Lake Washington and contamination in the drinking water. Okay, so you already have a receptor and it scores high, and you have migration if it scores high. It can't get any higher than that, right? Unless you changed your concentration or we added a new chemical to it, right? That's the only way it would really change. Okay.
Sounds good. And then I'm going to say I've noticed that we've had a couple challenges with our 5-minute timer, but I think we're probably close to our 5 minutes for this Q&A. So I will go ahead and say let's move on to our next topic. It looks like there's a couple questions left, and we will pick those up during the RAC discussion. And John Clark, I have noticed that your hand was raised. We will also come back to your question during the RAC open discussion. So please keep track of that question. Brian Howard will be here during that RAC open discussion to help address some of those additional questions. So now I would like to introduce, thank you. I would like to introduce Doug Close, who will be presenting on the interim stormwater treatment system. Take it away, Doug.
Good evening, everyone. Doug Close with Burrs Weston Services. We're here to give you another quarterly status on the interim stormwater treatment system. We'll begin with the next slide. As a reminder and an update to our timeline, the system that we're referencing has been online and treating daily since July of 2020. The data that we are going to present and provide tonight will cover the period of October 1 through December 31, and will update the operational efforts, including our effluent discharge monitoring for the PFOS, PFOA sampling, and we'll also remind everybody of our interprocessing sampling that we use throughout the monitoring of our system to control how it operates and respond accordingly in maintenance. One of the components to our schedule during this period was a significant carbon changeout that was executed in November of the period, and we've been running with this newer carbon and remaining or older resin during this period. Next slide, please. The data summary, again, October 1, December 31. It's the beginning of fall and the wetter season. For 40 of the 92 days, the pond water level remained below the weir, as we'll show in the graph. There was no bypass into Silver Stream. That's a dip from the prior quarter where we were managing the lower base flow at 75% of the time, going in, not going over the weir. More than 40 million gallons is treated during that period through our system, and the levels for our PFOS, PFOA in the effluent, what's being discharged, remained below 5 parts per trillion and were predominantly non-detect. Next slide. Another reminder for those that have been participating and a refresher for our new folks. This is the water flow of the system and how it's designed. If you begin in the upper left-hand corner, you'll see the intake water pump that is mounted in the rec pond. It draws water and sends it to initial filtration system. So there's two parts, filtration and treatment. It begins with separation and chemical addition to address some of our biofouling concerns. And then it goes through our sand filtration system, which consists of both coarse and finer to pick up the different size particles of our sediment and biogrowth that get in the water. From the sand vessels, it's directed into two separate housing, or actually 4 housings, 2 separate lineups of bag filtration with different size micron bags, again, to pick up the different size particles. Ultimately, through those 3 stages, we want to send the best water, the cleanest water that we can manage into our 2 treatment structures. So treatment, again, as a reminder, consists with a leading GAC, which is granular activated carbon, followed by another carbon vessel, and then a resin polish finish before all 4 chains join together in a combined effluent discharge into our outfall structure and then ultimately over the weir and down Silver Stream. Next slide, please. So a big snapshot picture view of sampling results on the left. This is your detections or concentrations of the influent. This is your raw water coming from the pond into our system. You can see a pretty constant bar across that. We're right around 300 parts per trillion average when you put those all together. 700-800 on some of the higher days. And then your right-hand side of the chart is your effluent after all of the filtration and treatment. And you can see the low indicators there at the bottom of the chart. We basically average about 1 part per trillion for the period. And again, several non-detects during treatment. Next slide. Another graph with a lot of data points, but we've kind of squeezed it in here so you can see the bigger picture on one slide. I've pointed out 3 distinct kind of peaks, but it's important to realize the data points along the chart are the water on a daily basis, the red line being the top of the weir elevation. So for instance, October 13th, we had a rain event. We were about a foot below the weir, and that brought it just to the second data, or the data point just above the red line under the high point was that one event. So a ½ inch rain event is about a foot of water across our pond. Same with the B event. That was a multiple day snow and rain event in November. From about mid-November through the rest of the right-hand side of the chart, this is where we really started to see a increase in our base flow. More water coming in, groundwater coming up, more storm events. The system was working at 500 GPM, but we had a much higher inflow, and we combated that for several weeks. As you can see, most of December really was much like in 2019, more than the system could handle. We found only a few days that we were able to control the bypass. Next slide, please. So recapping those months, pond conditions, including some turbidity, the algae regrowth, it continued from the summer into October. It wasn't as high as we reported in our last meeting. You saw the photos of all the biogrowth that was in our system in the summer months. That wasn't the case, but October still showing some algae, and the efforts to combat that algae probably went right into the beginning of November when it became colder. That started dying off, and then we were just dealing with more higher inflow. Both our primary and secondary carbons were changed due to that, and that was mid-November. Those seasonal events, the rain and snow, as you know, in that area started to increase. Our base flow went up, and that's, you know, right when we're at the system limit, mid-November through the month of December. Next slide, please. Just some snapshots, nothing in particular. The upper left-hand corner is typical drawdown. You can see along the edge there of the shore, we're about a foot down from the natural elevation of REC Pond. Average flow coming down, your concrete baffled structures that come off the tarmac and empty into REC Pond. There's 3 of those. And then of course we have the buried 17K storm drain as well. Those 4 are what flows the stormwater into REC Pond. Bottom left is a 1-inch rain event. You can see it overtook our outfall structure, and it's going over the weir at several thousand gallons a minute. And just a typical winter, wet, snow, ice, cold day in December. Next slide, please. Maintenance procedures, they continued and become really the driving efforts at the system. It's up to the system operator to keep the system clean of algae, sediment, biogrowth, all of those things through our filtration. Part of that is our efforts to do backwashing. We've automated our sand filtration. We can do that remotely. We can do it real time. We can do it manually. And that's a big part of it, along with treating and managing our carbon vessels in backwashing. Again, that's a minimum weekly thing, sometimes twice a week. As you tail towards the end of a media period or the life of media period, those efforts all start to increase. Resin is a material that we don't like to backwash, but find, again, late in the period of a lifetime of our media, we'll have to. Each of these include inspections, post-backwash visuals, where we will get in and make sure that we can actually see what is happening with the media. Is it stained? Is there some kind of indication that it's not level? So we'll get in there and we'll perform whatever's necessary to restore the media and get it back online. Next slide, please. I'm really starting to repeat myself a little bit, but the ongoing performance monitoring also includes a low dose of parasitic acid. We're constantly putting that in. It's helping us to a certain degree. It doesn't kill biogrowth, but it's helped keeping our system cleaner. We continue to evaluate that by looking at what's going on in our medias. One of the things that we mentioned in last quarter's meeting, and then I mentioned earlier, we have had really good success with the GAC change out in the primary resin. So us going to a GAC resin has been successful. The GAC is more robust. It helps us do a more aggressive backwashing and maintenance cleaning on a regular basis. And that's helping us to optimize the throughput. So if we can keep the pressures down, the media is clean, we can run at that 500 GPM and keep that drawdown. I think that might be it. Is there any more slides? No? Okay.
So it looks like it's time for our questions on the interim stormwater treatment system. Again, I will start reading from the previously submitted questions from the RAC. What are they, and I'm assuming that means the Air National Guard, planning to do in the rec pond, watershed, or stormwater sewer shed to reduce the impact of nutrients and sediments that cause the turbidity, algae, and weed growth that impacts the functionality of the treatment system?
Well, I probably won't address any of the sewer shed issues. That's a question for the remedial investigation and others. But to date, to combat, and I mentioned this in the presentation, it really has become up to the system operator to continue aggressive maintenance activities. We proposed and addressed a possible chemical addition to the pond. With consulting with the RAC, the community, the landowners, we opted not to get into that part of the phase, and we've really relied on our efforts to filter out the material to do the best that we can for trying to answer that question, what are we doing about the impacts of algae growth and seasonal weed growth? I think I can maybe share a time with Robert or Michelle if they want to add anything to that.
Yeah, so that pretty much covers it, Doug. It's mainly the in-pond treatment kind of stuff that we're focusing on. Essentially not up gradient. So Rec Pond is essentially the headwaters of Silver Stream. So there's not a lot that could be done up gradient to affect those things. So we're essentially just trying to catch it as it's coming into the treatment system and either remove it through the sand filtration, bag filtration, or through some sort of chemical addition that Doug talked about.
All right, thank you. Our next question is, what are they planning to do in the Rec Pond watershed or stormwater sewer shed to reduce the impact of stormwater volume, which results in higher inflow that impacts the stormwater treatment system drawdown capabilities?
Yeah, so right, we would love to slow down the amount of water coming into the pond, right? So we don't have this bypass and overflow situation. So right now there's some initial discussions with the Department of Transportation, looking at the 17K stormwater pipe. So it comes from adjacent to base, to the Stewart Air National Guard base, and drains an upgradient area, passes under the base, and then discharges into Rec Pond. There is one or two base drains that drain into that 17K, but those could be rerouted fairly easily. So somewhere along the way, PFAS impacted groundwater is getting into that 17K pipeline is what it seems like, that the storm sewer line. So looking at the possibility of diverting it, how can we not bring in all that storm water into Rec Pond? So the DOT is in the process of doing a study, feasibility type study, to see what can be done to divert it. And I think initially, they've come up with a few options with some dollar figures associated with it, and now it's kind of taking that next step and figuring out which one makes the most sense. Mike, if you had anything to add on that, go for it.
No, Robert, you said exactly what I was going to say. We do have a few options to look at and see which one works best for our system.
Wonderful. And then we'll squeeze in one more question. Were there any rain events that did not result in water level overtopping the weir? They mentioned it was hard to tell from the graphic. And then, is there a particular size storm that's a threshold for having the water level in Rec Pond staying within the limits of the weir for treatment?
So I'll take that one. There's a lot of components to go into that, but to quickly answer your question, it would be about a ½ inch rainstorm is typical, a 1 foot elevation rise. So if we're 1 foot below the weir, like, let me use for example, right? Yesterday or today, after the storm event, we were 14 inches below the weir. So if we got a ½ inch rain tonight on top of that, we would probably remain just below the weir at 12 inches of pond elevation increase. So that's sort of our threshold that we use. With, some storms are different, but that's the best answer I could give you. We have had instances where we've been down like 14 inches. We had a 7/10 inch storm, and it brought the water right up to the top of the weir structure. And I've got to also remind folks, and just to be transparent, when we log and record bypass, it can be 10 gallons. If the water goes over the weir and the instrument detects it, it's a bypass. So there's many data points out there, and it affects our percentage, but it's a very small amount in some cases.
Thank you, Doug. So that wraps up our time for the RAC questions for the interim stormwater treatment system. If we'll move on to the next slide, that takes us into RAC business or our RAC open discussion, which I mentioned again, we will go back and address those questions that were submitted to us prior to this meeting. Before we start that discussion, I do want to mention that in addition to our RAC members, we have a number of other governmental representatives who are on the phone call today. We have representatives from Senator Schumer's office, Senator Gillibrand's office, as well as the New York State Department of Health, the Department of Environmental Conservation, the Port Authority, and other government representatives. So we'd like to thank you all for participating in our RAC meeting and sharing with the community members and getting this informational update. So next slide, please. We will continue on our questions that were previously submitted, and we'll go back to the 2 questions that were left regarding the relative risk site evaluation. And the first question is, besides the RRSE, what other factors are considered for prioritization? So I will ask Brian Howard and Keith Freihoffer to come back on. I don't know which one will respond to that question.
Hi, this is Keith. I just got a message from Dr. Howard. He lost his connection and is going to try to get back online. Could we delay the RRC questions till after the others?
We can do that.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. So then I guess we are back to the interim stormwater treatment system questions. So Doug and Robert and Michelle, if you will come back. Our next question is, how do those levels, and these are talking about the influent PFOS and PFOA levels, how do those levels relate to rainfall and or water level in REC Pond? Were the PFOS, PFOA levels that were measured in REC Pond influent this fall higher during wet or dry periods?
Okay, sorry. I didn't know I'd be on. I was stepped away here. Okay.
Do you want me to reread the questions?
Yeah, if you wouldn't mind, unless somebody else has it.
So we're talking about the influent PFOS and PFOA levels, and they're wondering, do these levels relate to rainfall and or water level in the REC Pond? And were the PFOS and PFOA levels that were measured in REC Pond influent this fall higher during wet or dry periods?
Okay, well, I think I get the question. The higher influent concentrations are typically during periods when flow into the pond are low. So less rain, higher concentration. So the exact opposite for the lower concentration. The more rain, everybody's heard dilution as a solution. There's a little bit of that going on there.
Thank you. Our next question is, you all may know this already, but I'm not familiar enough to know the answer related to water level in the REC Pond. Once a storm is over, what are the mechanisms by which water level drops? Is it evaporation, infiltration into the base soils? If I remember correctly, REC Pond is not lined. I'm trying to understand other pathways for PFOS to enter the environment from REC Pond, in addition to flowing over the weir and into Silver Stream.
So for us, the biggest factor is the higher inflow into the pond, the size of the pond. Once that inflow begins to drop, then the system can start catching up with the drawdown. So the water goes up around the pond. It's going over the weir at 900,000 gallons a minute. When it starts to stabilize more at its more natural elevation, that's when our system can catch up with it. So evaporation, yeah, it's there. Seepage into the ground a little bit, but really it becomes a factor of holding capacity. That's the mechanism. How much can that watershed behind the weir hold? That's when we can start catching up with the drawdown.
Yeah, and I'll add to that too, Doug. So as Doug mentioned, it's the primary pathway is over the weir. There's some infiltration, probably not a big factor. So yeah, it's spilling over the weir. That's where it's going. There, I wouldn't anticipate there being really some other mysterious pathway. It's going over the weir.
All right, thank you. That looks like the end of the questions for the interim stormwater treatment system. And it is not looking like Dr. Howard has joined us yet. So I will move on to some of the other questions that were listed. The first one is, what other agencies/entities need to be involved in the cleanup to solve the problem? And I don't know, I think that's more of a Nicole or Keith question, or if there's someone else from NGB that would like to respond.
I'll go ahead and address that. So as far as the question being solving the problem, the way we would define the problem is PFAS impacts from A&G mission-related activities. So defining it that way, the agencies and entities that would be involved would be the RAC, as well as other community stakeholders like our regulatory agencies. So that would be DC that I mentioned earlier, as well as New York State Department of Health, and also Port Authority for New York and New Jersey for the civilian side of the airport, because of their the interconnectedness of the stormwater system from their property onto the base. Thanks.
Thank you. The next question is, we know that scores of military bases across the country have contaminated the drinking water supply of their local communities. Our new federal administration and bipartisan congressional committees have begun to address these concerns, as well as the larger concerns of PFAS found throughout the environment and consumer products. The National PFAS Coalition, an activist group, is gaining ground with their goal of removing PFAS and forever chemicals from the environment altogether. Some anticipated policy changes include, but are not limited to, accelerating DoD cleanup efforts, responding properly to new EPA guidelines, and discontinuing the use of fire foam and other PFAS products. What is your response to these anticipated policy changes?
Okay, so I'll take this question. So basically, the Department of Defense, the Department of Defense has a PFAS task force, and they are charged with setting DoD policy related to PFAS. So the Air National Guard, we don't set PFAS policy for the DoD. So what we do is we'll turn to the DoD to see what kind of policies they issue and adhere to those. That's it.
Thank you, Jody. And the last question for this topic is, what is the scope of the study?
And I'll take that one. So the question is a little bit general. I'm interpreting it to mean, what is the scope of the remedial investigation or RI study? And if that's the case, then again, I'm go back to that an RI's purpose is to determine the nature and extent of the PFAS impacts. And specifically, we will be focusing on the PFAS impacts from Air National Guard mission-related activities. So that will include sampling of multiple media similar to the previous site inspection and expanded site inspection. We'll be looking at groundwater, soil, sediment, surface water, stormwater, So it will be a more extensive investigation that will include off-base sampling. We will look at potential receptors, but we will be focusing on receptors from ANG mission-related activities. That's it. Thanks.
Nicole. So I cannot tell if Dr. Howard has been able to rejoin us or not. Keith, do you have an update on that?
His internet is down, so he is not rejoining us at this time. But I can answer the last 2 questions, or the best I can. Thank you.
Okay, so we'll go back. Besides the RRSE, what other factors are considered for prioritization?
Yeah, there are 2 other things considered. That would be the number of people impacted, and then public concern would be other things that could be considered for prioritization.
Thank you. And then when will the final prioritization be complete?
I do not have a time frame for that. The sequencing is being performed to include active and reserve Air Force, along with Air National Guard. So that's 75 of our installations and 85 of the active and reserve installations. So it's a big process, and we don't have a date yet as to committed when that will be complete and finalized.
All right, thank you. So now we have some time to address those questions, and John Clark, Bill Fetter, and Deborah Brown, I see your hands raised. We will start with John Clark and then move through our list. John, I believe I've unmuted you from my end. You may have to unmute yourself.
Hello, thank you. Thank you everyone for your work, your presentations, and your time. Public concern is kind of an interesting subjective criteria for RRSE, but such is the case. So I guess I had some questions for Dr. Howard about the cumulative effect. My first question would be, is the RRSE scoring, is it just a single score? And is that single score a result of the accumulation of different medias, but also different sample locations? Or is it just a singular score, the highest of any of the things considered? And then secondarily to that, maybe toward one of the ANG project managers, does the scoring and that risk assessment affect the decision of action from the remedial investigation?
Again, Dr. Howard has not been able to rejoin us. Jody, does it make sense to answer questions directed to him in the Q&A that's submitted afterwards?
Yeah, we can take down those questions related to some of the more specific technical aspects of the RRSE and provide that following the RAC meeting.
Thank you.
Okay, so he could help with maybe the understanding of the formulation of the final risk assessment, but so we've heard in the remedial investigation, there clearly is a robust process for determining the RRSE. What is the process for determining what is a significant or insignificant media or pathway or receptor for choice of remediation in that RI? Is there a process?
I can try to speak to that. So after the remedial investigation is complete, we will perform a circular feasibility study, and that will review recommended remedial actions that were brought up in the RI and try to come up with a path forward for how best to perform any cleanup actions that were determined necessary in the RI.
So maybe not a specific scoring process like the RRSE.
Right. No, I believe it's just it takes into account many different factors such as cost of remediation and things like that in the feasibility study, the next phase of the circle process.
Thank you. That's it.
Thank you, John. So Bill Fetter, we are coming back to you. I think you can unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hi, folks. This is probably more steered towards Doug and the filtration system. I'm curious, is there a toxicity to the resin that you're reluctant to backwash it, or is it just a matter of particulate size and keeping it confined during a backwash, or why are you reluctant to backwash? Do we lose Doug?
No, I'm here. I'm
okay.
Having a pointer problem. Really, to answer your question, the makeup of the resin, it's such a lighter material, less robust, and it becomes mobile with our, if you remember, well, maybe you weren't in some of the last meetings.
I've been there.
Yeah, we backwash by flowing clean water down through, and it gets behind and gets through the media,
right.
You know, and tries to push out the sedimentation or the dirty material out. The resin is so light that it can become mobile with that sedimentation that we're backwashing, we're trying to clean out, so it becomes vulnerable.
Okay.
And or it can create cavities. You know, we watch for openings or bypasses where you're not getting complete contact. The water's not getting through a whole media bed.
Right. Channeling, yeah.
Right. Channeling is the perfect word. Yeah.
Understood. Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right. Thanks, Bill. And it looks like we have just enough time to get to Deborah's question. I think, Deborah, you're unmuted now.
Great, thank you. I wanted to just follow up on the question about in terms of solving the problem and having to intersect with other agencies that are involved. I'm wondering, in addition to the people that you mentioned, the Port Authority, DOT, DEC, DOH, et cetera, are there other federal agencies that might regulate you? For instance, FAA regulating the type of firefighting foam that you must use. In this case, if it has to have PFAS in it or a PFAS, one of those family of chemicals. Are you doing any outreach to agencies to whom you are beholden in terms of regulations that may impact what you're able to do? I hope that's clear.
So in answering that, we are regulated through the Environmental Protection Agency at the federal level, as well as New York State DC at the state level. And there are not promulgated standards for PFAS and PFOA or other PFAS from the EPA. There are state standards for drinking water at this time from the state of New York. In the CERCLA process, again, that's the federal cleanup law, we primarily evaluate applicable regulations, and there's a term for it that's called an ARAR, applicable or, sorry, I blanked on it. I'll let you know that in a second. But an ARAR is a requirement that is legally determined to be applicable to the cleanup effort. And that process typically starts around the feasibility study. And so as we look at cleanup objectives for the final cleanup action, we will be looking at various regulations at that time.
Okay, thank you.
All right, and I would like to thank all of our RAC members for their questions, for the questions that they submitted in advance, as well as for those of you who have asked questions during our RAC open discussion. Again, John or others, if you had some specific questions for Dr. Howard, if you could please either put those together with the questions that get submitted after the meeting, or just email them or make sure that they're entered into our question module. Then we'll make sure to forward those along to Dr. Howard and get those responses that we submit after the meeting and is included in that meeting package. As a reminder to everyone else, if we can move on to our next slide, it is time to start our public question and answer period. And all of those questions are being submitted through our question module. If you make sure they get in there, we will respond to them. And if we don't have time in the 20 minutes that we have allotted, again, we respond to those questions in writing after the meeting, and then we'll come out with those RAC meeting packages and uploaded to the administrative record. So our first question is coming to us from Robert Sanchez, Robert Sanchez, and he's asking, is the city of Newburgh still using the Brown Pond water? And I don't know if that's something one of our members can answer, or if not, I can see if Mr. Grice or someone from the city wants to raise their hand. We can unmute them to respond to that as well.
I think that would be a good idea to unmute someone from the city to respond to that. And while you're doing that, Heather, I'll just throw in there, sorry, I blanked on ARAR earlier. It's applicable or relevant and appropriate requirement. So ARAR. Thanks.
Okay, I think I'm unmuted.
Oh, all right.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I was having technical difficulties, so I apologize. We are on Browns Pond, and when we are not there, we use the Catskill Aqueduct. Did that answer?
I believe so. Thank you, Councilman Grice. Next question is coming to us from Emily Vale. She asks, is Stewart Air National Guard base considered a site, or are there multiple sites within the Stewart Air National Guard base?
That's a good question, and I guess the answer is kind of yes and yes, because it is generally referred, the installation-wide can be referred to as the site, but we also have sites within the installation that are studied. So I've mentioned Site 3, which is the former base landfill. As far as PFAS sites, we currently are calling them potential release locations, and those will end up becoming PFAS sites as well.
This is Michelle Olderman. My connection's bad, so my web camera's not on, but I think this was in reference to Brian Howard's presentation, and I believe, if I'm accurate, in that presentation, Stewart Air National Guard base would be considered an installation, and the different landfill sites, the fire training areas would each be considered a site.
Thanks, Michelle. And Heather, I was just going to ask, I'm seeing here that Brian Howard, I think, is on but is muted. Can someone check to see if he can be unmuted? And you can keep going. I just wanted to put that in the background that possibly he might be able to answer questions.
All right, I will search for that after this next question. This is coming from Deborah Brown. And she is making a statement that says there is a filtration system, but it doesn't filter out short chain PFAS. She's making that statement. I didn't know if anyone wanted to address that statement.
Yeah, I'll comment on that. I believe the assumption with that is the treatment system on Washington Lake, since I've heard that being mentioned before, that has carbon on it, but is also not as effective at getting out the short chain PFASs. That's not the situation for the interim stormwater treatment system with the combination of the carbon and the resin, which pulls out the short chain PFAS constituents.
Thank you, Robert. And welcome back, Brian Howard.
Sorry about that. I'm sorry.
I think if it's all right with everyone, I'd like to go back, and I'm having trouble finding you, but oh, here we go. John Clark, did you want to ask your question again since Dr. Howard has been able to join us?
Sure, that would be great. So in the RRSE process, is the end result just a single number classification for the entire project, or is it per potential release sites?
Each PRL gets a score of high or low or medium, right? And for soil and for groundwater.
And is there some cumulative effect that it calculates into the end number, or is it just the highest number? The highest level, the highest, risk?
Well, the more higher risk sites that an installation would have, then total overall sequencing for that installation would make it go up.
I'm sorry, can you repeat that? It is cumulative, or it is not cumulative?
So it's not cumulative. You would say, okay, if I had multiple sites on an installation that scored high, that installation would score higher than another installation that scored medium, low, high, for example. Does that make sense? So in the relative risk, the installation would score higher. It would rank higher for its sequencing.
Okay, so there is some level of ranking that's beyond just high, medium, low.
Yes, there is.
Do you haven't any indication where Stewart is or where we are in the process on that?
I don't have that yet because I don't think Stewart's is all finished, right? Nicole or Jody, I guess.
We've worked through the worksheets and are going through the QA process. And so at this point, we're not ready to share that material. It's being reviewed by the Air Force. And as was mentioned earlier, there will be a public comment period in the spring, but we're still, working on those spreadsheets.
And how does public concern, how does that get scored?
So that doesn't get scored. That's another consideration. So there's a score, right? That you come up with a site, and then there can be other factors. It's not the sole factor. The RRSE score isn't the sole factor, right, in sequencing. There can be other considerations. I mean, I'm just making this up notionally, okay? So let's say we had a site that scored the same, two sites that score the same, but one of them impacts one well, but it scored a high, right? And another one impacts 10,000 people, right? So the relative risk site evaluation, it doesn't consider that, but there are management considerations that people can look at it and think about it and make a decision. I think this one should go before that one.
Thank you. And so just one last follow-up. And so are those considerations, including public concern and number of population, are those in the final report? We'll be able to see those?
No, we haven't done that in the final report. All I've done is the relative risk site evaluation and what the rankings are.
Okay.
Right. Other considerations could be considered if needed. And that's all in the RRSE primer. And I think there's a common Q&A fact sheet that the Guard is going to put up for you to look at. But there has a hold on just a minute here. I've got it. I think I have it. It's I can read it to you. This is right out of the RRSE. The actual funding priority for a site is identified after our relative risk information is combined with other important management considerations. For example, the statutory and regulatory status of a particular installation or site, public stakeholder concerns, program execution considerations, and economic factors. These additional risk management considerations can result in a decision to fund a work at a site that is not classified as high relative risk. Anyway, so that's right out of the primer. If you can download it and read it. So there's their scores get all compiled and put together, and then that would be a decision that needed to be made if you only had if you had a constrained amount of funding that you were trying to spend and make a decision on which installation would go first or which site would go first.
Which we always do, right? Thank you.
Thank you, John. And I was about to say, I think we wanted to try to address some of our other public questions. The next one I think might also be for you, Dr. Howard. So since the real receptors of the contamination are people, do you use incidences of illness information from the CDC Toxic and Disease Registry and the Department of Health Cancer Registry to determine the score? And that question is coming from Jack Caldwell.
No, we don't. That's not how RRSE is set up to work. I understand where you're coming from, but that it's just to prioritize the start of the sequencing for funding for, I mean, you have to consider we have 800 sites and active, plus Guard has another 800, so and 155 installations, and we don't have enough funding to do all of those simultaneously. Nor do we even have the infrastructure to support that, the number of people to review all those documents, the regulators to review the documents, all that sort of thing. So we have to sequence and go, this chunk highest priority goes first, and the next priority goes when we get the next chunk of money, and we go on down the road like that.
Thank you. Our next question is from Natalia G. And she asks, what type of reparations are you planning for people who have been affected by the contaminated water exposure in Newburgh?
That's beyond the scope of what we do. We address the contamination and try to fix it. And that's, there's a whole nother branch of litigation in the Air Force and DOJ that handles all that sort of thing. I'm here to try to fix, we're here to, all of us working here are trying to fix this release and get it cleaned up.
Thank you. Does anyone else from National Guard Bureau want to comment on that? Okay. No. Our next question is for the long-term monitoring site 3, DEC. When you say acceptance, what does that mean? How and what does acceptance mean? And were there comments from DEC? And that question is from Chuck Thomas.
Hi, Chuck. This is Nicole. So when DEC accepts a report, I believe the letter said that the report was completed in accordance with the work plan and that the monitoring was completed in accordance with the work plan. So that would be what accepted is. As far as that particular report, I don't believe we had DEC comments on them, but we, as I said in the past, when we receive stakeholder comments, we put them in an appendix to the report. And so those would go in the final report on the administrative record. So for example, you'll see that in the expanded site inspection report, there are definitely DEC comments and responses to those comments within the report.
Thank you, Nicole. Our next question is from Councilman Anthony Grace. There seems to be a disconnect, as I recall, that there was gunk at times and all stormwater was not able to be caught. And if I can find you, Mr. Grice, I didn't know, did you want to expand on that at all, or?
I am still having technical difficulties, so I apologize. It seems that some of the reports that I'm hearing, and it could be me, but it seems like some of them we've heard already, and I do understand that there are new members here, and maybe they have to be caught up to speed, but some of them seem, you know, information that I've heard. And then right after that, I'm getting feedback also, so I apologize. About the overflow and how much water was being caught there. I'm getting a lot of feedback. I'm gonna pause.
All right, so Doug or Robert, do you want to address at least the overflow in some of Councilman Grice's comments?
Yeah, I don't fully understand the question, but I know you had mentioned something about gunk. So so right, initially, you know, the system was getting fouled up with a bunch of different things, but that's the team has I guess implemented different maintenance type measures to overcome that. So they have to continue to stay on top of it and do the, you know, the chemical addition and the backwashing and those sort of things to keep that gunk out of the system. So they have, I guess, come up with ways to combat that. So still an issue, but have a path forward to overcome it. And then on the bypass, so I guess it is worth mentioning. So when during a storm event or when there's more water than the system can handle, the system is still running. It's not shut off. Only, you know, during a major storm event, there was one that was either 2 or 4 inches that kind of, you know, caused some minor damage to the equipment. Then it's shut off. But typically it's running. So there's more water than the system can handle. So that it's still pumping and treating, and the clean water is going out, and then a certain amount of water is not being captured by the system, and that's the bypass. So hopefully that helps provide, I guess, a little more insight. If you had a specific piece of that you were trying to ask about, feel free to ask away.
This is Michelle. I just wanted to add one additional thing on that gunk. Some of the issues we were seeing with the biofouling, are seasonal issues that are going to be around, you know, in the warmer months when the algae grow and things like that. So as we entered into the wetter period, the colder months, we also entered into a time frame, a seasonality that doesn't have as much of that bio growth. So that also helps our system in addition to the pre-treatment changes and alterations we've made to the system.
Thank you, Michelle and Robert. And I am going to ask that we pop up our next slide. We are coming to kind of the end of our 20-minute period for the public questions. And so if you have any other questions, please get them into our question module. I am going to go ahead and ask one final question, but up on your screen now, there is an email link to Victoria Loon, one of our members of the RAC. She will be accepting questions through February 15th. So if you think of something after this meeting and still want to get that in, please jot down her email address and you can send that to her, and we will respond to those questions after the fact. So one final question: how many times does the filter need to be changed in comparison to how frequently it typically should be changed? At one point, I thought the filter needed to be changed much more frequently than it was, or that it was overwhelming. Has this changed, and if so, what changed? And that is coming to us from Cassie Skylars.
Yeah, so I'll take an initial stab at that. So I guess many components to the filter. So it depends on which component. So you have the sand filtration, you have the bag filters, and you have the carbon, and then you have the resin. So the bag filters had to be changed a whole lot more often than anticipated initially when it started up. You know, I think it was several times a day initially, and then they added the sand filtration, and then that had to be changed out less. But you may be referring to the real media, the carbon and the resin that strip out the PFAS. So that's varied. So it's tough to say. I guess coming in, most of the work done to date on pump and treat of water with PFAS has been drinking water. So a lot of the things that the estimates were based on was based on filtering drinking water and how long, I say, carbon or resin should last when you're treating drinking water. So right, that all kind of went out the door, treating stormwater and all this other gunk in there that caused them to have to be changed out sooner than anticipated. But with all these other additions, the bag filters, the sand filtration, I think it's been going about 3 to 4 months. Is that about right, Michelle? The most recent GAC, I think it was changed in September. We're coming up again, so 4 months for the carbon, and I think comparable for the resin. But I guess Doug or Michelle, let you guys verify those dates.
Yeah, that's right, Robert. We're running at about a 5-month period for the resin coming up on it, and we're looking at a 3-month period for the new carbon that was changed in early November. But we're still operating, still compliant, so the media is still in play. So each month, and I think the most important thing that Michelle mentioned earlier, it's seasonal effect. The summer has a different effect on all of our components, whether it's filtration or media. The winter is different. So, you know, we're 6 months, July to February, maybe 7, that we're learning. And I think you answered the question. I mean, I don't have anything else to add.
I'll add just one more thing. Robert, you mentioned it, you know, Stewart Air National Guard was one of only a second in the country system to treat PFAS and stormwater. So a lot of what we went into this project with was knowledge of treating groundwater, which doesn't have as much gunk, I'll use that word, affecting the system and the treatment abilities. So it has been a learning process. So yes, our media hasn't been operating as long as it would with a typical groundwater system. But what was really overwhelming was changing out the bag filters, because initially we had very fine bag filters on the system, and the staff, the operators, were having to change those out multiple times a day for a while. And then the system changes that we implemented, we have more coarse bag filters also, and we have the sand filters. So those have really increased our ability to operate without change outs of those bag filters as often.
Thank you, Robert, Michelle, and Doug. As I mentioned before, it is 8 o'clock, and we've completed our 20 minutes for those public questions. Again, I appreciate all of those questions. We will be downloading the questions that have been inputted into our questions module and providing responses to any questions that we did not address during the meeting. That will be included in our final package, where we include a copy of the slide deck, the transcript from the meeting, and a number of other meeting materials. I would like to thank everyone for their participation. Again, welcome to our new RAC members and our new RAC co-chair. And I just want to open it up to Colonel Cook and Edward Lawson and see if you have any final comments before we close out this evening.
Thanks, Heather. I just wanted to say thank you again to everyone for joining us. As I think we've demonstrated, we continue to work on this issue as best we can and run a mitigation through that filtration system as much as we can. Also like to reiterate what Mr. Lawson had said. We are in this together, and our goal is to be as transparent and educational as possible, and to work the process as diligently as possible. So thank you again to all, and we look forward to being able to get you on base to see the filtration system in work as soon as we can get past the COVID restrictions that we have. Thank you and have a good night.
Thank you, Colonel Cook. Co-Chair Lawson, did you want to make any final comments before we close out our meeting? It doesn't look like it. So again, thank you to everyone for your participation, and we look forward to seeing you in April. Have a good evening.
Thank you, Heather.
Thank you.